This is the second set of notes for Unit 5. This part is about active transport in ATP. In the last section, we were talking about passive transport, where molecules move along their concentration gradient, not requiring energy. In active transport, molecules are moved against their concentration gradient, moving from an area of lower concentration to one of higher concentration. In order to do this, it requires energy. Cells have to do some work or provide some energy for this to happen. It's like if you're going up a hill with your bicycle or your skateboard, you have to expend some energy to go up the hill, whereas passive transport is like going down the hill, where all you have to do is just have a little push off. So one kind of transport protein that will take care of this process is something called a pump. These are transport proteins that actively transport small molecules like ions across the membrane against their concentration gradient. This does require energy to do work. A good example of a pump is a sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump makes sure that you have the right concentration of sodium ions outside the cell and potassium ions inside the cell so the cells can work properly. This is especially important for things like nerve cells and muscle cells. So there are places in the molecule for sodium ions to fit. It holds 3 sodium ions moving from the cytoplasm. Once they're attached there, an ATP molecule, which is an energy transfer molecule used by cells, will transfer a phosphate to the protein, and that causes the protein to change shape. But changed shape, it turns this and moves it to the outside so that it releases those 3 sodium ions, picks up 2 potassium ions, then the phosphate comes off, and that causes the protein to change shape again back to the original shape and release the potassium ions into the cell. This happens over and over again, maintaining a high concentration of potassium inside the cell and a high concentration of sodium outside the cell, moving those ions against their concentration gradient. It does require energy for this to happen. Now, there are other kinds of active transport involving larger molecules or particles of food or cells. There are 2 types of active transport involving these larger particles. These are called endocytosis and exocytosis. Endo means within, and so endocytosis is bringing large materials into or within the cell. It does this by pinching off a part of the membrane or pinching in a part of the membrane to form a vesicle enclosing the particles. This is what happens when an amoeba or a white blood cell consumes a bacterium or some other organism or other molecules that are outside the cell. This is called phagocytosis or phagocytosis, which is cellular eating, and this involves larger particles like bacteria or other types of molecules like that. And the other type of endocytosis is pinocytosis, which is kind of like cellular drinking, and that's smaller particles or droplets of liquid that can be brought into the cell. The second type of active transport involving larger particles is exocytosis. Exo means outside, and so this sends large materials outside the cell. A vesicle containing molecules from the cell, either waste products or products of the cell metabolism like proteins or hormones. The vesicle produced from the Golgi apparatus can fuse with the cell membrane and expel the contents outside the cell. So if you have a white blood cell that's removing bacterial cells from the body, then of course the process will be endocytosis, specifically phagocytosis. Now, energy, we talked about energy, and so let's talk about how we're going to get energy in the cell and how energy is used and the functional molecule that transfers energy. Energy is by definition the ability to do work, and you've learned in previous science classes before about the 2 main types of energy: kinetic energy, which is energy of motion, and potential energy, which is stored energy. Some good examples of kinetic energy would be heat and light, because that involves the motion of some molecules. Potential energy oftentimes has to do with position or structure, and so chemical energy that cells use is a type of potential energy where the energy is stored in the bonds of the molecules. Now, you've also learned about the law of conservation of energy. Here it is defined for you again. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred or transformed. These energy transformations in living things occur or happen during chemical reactions. And so there are two kinds of chemical reactions. There are what we call exergonic reactions where energy is released. What occurs here is the reactants that you start with have a higher potential energy than the products do, so energy is released here. And then we have endergonic reactions where energy has to be added. The reactants are a lower potential energy than the products, so you have to add energy in. So here are the definitions. An exergonic means releases energy, and an endergonic requires energy. You may have learned about exothermic and endothermic reactions, and those are types of exergonic and endergonic reactions, but exothermic and endothermic apply specifically to heat, and sometimes the energy is not in the form of heat. So what do cells use to store energy? Well, they use a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, which is abbreviated ATP. Adenosine triphosphate is composed of three different molecules: adenine, which is one of those nucleotides that we find in DNA and RNA, a ribose sugar, which is the sugar found in RNA, and three phosphates. This part, the adenine and the ribose and one of the phosphates, makes up an adenine nucleotide. And so this is basically an adenine RNA nucleotide with two additional phosphates added on. ATP stores the chemical energy that cells can use for work, and it releases the energy when the cell needs it. It does this by undergoing a hydrolysis reaction to break off one of those potassiums that are, or phosphates that are attached to the ATP molecule, forming ADP or adenosine diphosphate and releasing a free phosphate and some energy. So this is how the transformation occurs, from moving from the potential energy that is included in ATP and releasing some of that energy for the cell to use as work. This is a cycle that repeats over and over again in cells, sometimes millions, trillions of times per second in some cells. Energy from the exergonic reactions that occur in things like cellular respiration will produce ATP by a process called phosphorylation, and we'll learn a little bit more about that in a later unit. And then that ATP can undergo hydrolysis to release that energy for endergonic reactions and produce ADP and inorganic phosphate in the cytoplasm, which can then be rephosphorylated into ATP by this exergonic energy. In our next notes, we'll talk about how some of this energy is used in cells.